Good morning. My name is Jerome Tennille. I am a social good professional with about 8 years of experience in both corporate responsibility and nonprofit engagement. Today, we will be discussing some of the essential elements of volunteer engagement. Now, before we continue, I want to share a little bit more about myself, as I believe that my experiences, both personally and professionally, have really shaped the way that I understand and look at engagement in a successful manner. So I served in the military from 2004 to 2012, and it was over those 8 years that I realized that I was very duty-driven as a person. In 2012, I transitioned from the US Navy and I began a career in nonprofit management, where I worked, did specifically volunteer engagement at a national nonprofit here in the United States, where I did that work for about 6 years. I went to school and studied operations management, and also got my graduate degree in sustainability leadership at Arizona State University. I also am a big believer and champion of disruption where it's necessary. If you're not challenged, then you're not growing. And I think more so now than ever before, as we think about having a positive impact on society, that means getting out of societal norms and progressing us into a way that is more positive for society and the environment. So I seek to disrupt again where it's necessary and pulling us out of the status quo. I'm a social impact blogger. It's called Responsible AF, and it's on my website, jerometennille.com. I also write and contribute elsewhere. You can find some of my writing on Volunteer Match, nonprofitinformation.com, and I'm a contributor to impactor.com, which is a sustainability and social impact lifestyle online magazine. All right, so what are the essential elements of volunteer engagement? We are going to talk about what I believe is sort of an engagement life cycle, and we are going to think about this in a way that you'll be able to apply this to your needs upon completion of this training. At the end of this training, you will understand the value of having an engagement life cycle. You will be able to understand and describe each element of the engagement life cycle. And then most importantly, you'll be able to apply each element of the life cycle to volunteer engagement in all environments, whether you work in corporate responsibility for a government agency or in national service or at a nonprofit or any flavor of those. So first, I just want to sort of level set here. I want to first talk about who actually engages volunteers. The first thing that I'll mention is currently it's estimated that 70% of all the world's volunteer engagement is informal. And what I mean by that is this is volunteers, individuals in their community or for their family, volunteering as individuals directly to supporting those within their immediate circle, and doing so while not going through an established or formalized organization. So it's estimated again that 70% of all volunteer engagement is done in an informal capacity. All right, so the 30% that is left engages volunteers for the sake of their mission and to serve the communities through various means. The first and most obvious is definitely the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector, they support a lot of different causes, everything from the LGBTQ community to veterans, women empowerment, the environment. Also underneath the spectrum of nonprofit sector, that might also include houses of worship and even education institutes. The second area where we see a lot of engagement through volunteerism is corporations and responsible business. This is in the form of employee volunteer programs where within the company, managers of these corporate responsibility programs, they seek to engage their employees from within the company to get out into the communities where they do business. The governments, again, also play a critical role in serving the community through national service programs and other agency functions. Another well-known is, the parks and recreation services that we all see and hold dear to our hearts within the counties and the states where we live. And then also you see a lot of activism and grassroots movements, and this is again through a lot of the civic engagement that we see, that we've seen a spike in over the last 4 years, where people are taking to the streets to volunteer, to champion very specific issues that are near to their hearts. So when we talk about who actually engages volunteers, I also want to, sort of, paint the scene so people understand the functions that volunteers play within some of these larger entities. What I will also say is that the engagement life cycle that we're going to discuss here in the next several slides, it should exist in its entirety for each of these entities, whether they're corporations, nonprofits, or government. The actual life cycle doesn't change. The only thing that really changes is who you're engaging and then where that energy is being pushed. And so we're going to go through that here in this slide. When we think about corporations and businesses, when they engage, when they recruit volunteers, they're generally doing that from within their company, their company structure, and then they are seeking to build that support from within, pushing them out into the communities where they do business. So the life cycle will still exist, but who they're targeting would be their employees, and then the direction that they're pushing that energy would be out into the communities where they do business, surrounding their brick and mortar locations. And then when we look at nonprofits and the government, generally nonprofits and governments are seeking volunteers from outside of their structures, and they are seeking to pull them in. And by pulling them in and through the services and the programs that they've created, they're able to pull volunteers from within, from within the community, from outside their organization, into their organizations to support their different functions. And so I felt that this distinction was important because I think people, they look at volunteer engagement from CSR, from nonprofits, and from government as being wildly different. And they're really not. Once you start to break down the process of who's being engaged and where they're being pushed, you see that the process is almost identical, but who they're targeting to be volunteers and where they're pushing them might differ greatly. So here are some of the elements that we are going to discuss today. When we think about this life cycle, of course, there is the beginning, but then where do you go from there, right? There's the outreach. There's building the rapport and the trust and the relationship. Beyond that, there's the actual recruitment, making the ask. Once you get their commitment, then it's providing them the training, the orientation, and fully equipping them to carry out the functions that they're being asked to perform. They go to the event. That's where you're staffing the volunteers. There's the post-event communication that has to take place once the event is concluded. There's another call to action. And then there's the impact collection. And what you'll see is that it's a whole life cycle that exists here. The other thing that I'll mention is once you get through that full life cycle and you get to the beginning, once again, the idea is to make this life cycle incredibly efficient so it cuts down on the amount of recruitment and rapport building that you have to do moving forward. So ideally, once you get back to the beginning, you should be able to more effectively, more efficiently breeze through the outreach, rapport building, and recruitment because you will have done a lot of that legwork and built that foundation the first time. All right, so now understanding that, we are going to dissect each of the essential elements that exist, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. All right, so once we get through the beginning phase, which is essentially just making the decision to act, you have to go into outreach. This is the part of the phase where you're going to express an interest in gaining support. If you're working at a for-profit company, then that might be seeking interest in gaining support from within the company, whether it's a different department or maybe it's some of your senior most leaders or very specific skill sets that you're seeking within the company, getting their interest. If you're working at a nonprofit or a government agency, then perhaps you are seeking to gain that interest from a company or from another community or individual volunteers from all different walks of life, that reside in that community. You're also going through the process of, seeking to get that interest and that commitment through understanding the mutual interest. And so what I always say is as you're going through the outreach phase, make sure you reach out to those who you believe are aligned with your values and aligned with seeing eye to eye with the services that you provide and having a mutual interest in supporting one another. You always want to make sure that the outreach that you seek to perform is personal and authentic. Nobody really likes that salesy salesman type of pitch. And so, make sure that, you're not just throwing everything at the wall just to see what sticks, but that you're doing a really process-oriented, methodical outreach and make sure that it's personal and really authentic. And then again, I always tell people avoid cold calls as much as you can. There is nothing that really stifles the mood or the enthusiasm of somebody from getting a cold call. I don't like getting cold calls, whether that's from a marketer or a salesman or a nonprofit just seeking to get support for the sake of getting support. So be very cautious with your outreach. Now, once you identify a group who you're seeking that support from, now, once you've got that connection, now it's really about building that rapport, building that relationship and that trust. I always think about this as building relationships with friends or acquaintances, or even if you're dating romantically, you explore the common interests. And you really want to start slow. Again, treating this like a first date, you want to think through some easy, quick hit introductory opportunities to get these folks, engaged and involved in your mission or what programmatics you have without asking too much of them. Again, when you're thinking about this as sort of the first date mentality, you would never go on a first date with somebody and ask for marriage. And so you would never go on an introductory conversation with somebody who has an interest to volunteer and then ask for everything under the sun in terms of, tens or hundreds of hours of their time and financial commitments. You always want to really start from a place of building that trust and then building on top of that as you go, as they start to get their feet wet and wade a little bit deeper into the pool. Once we get to a place of comfort, this is when you should make the ask. And again, if you're engaging for volunteers, please do not ask for money. I've been on both sides, working at a nonprofit and working in corporate responsibility. And from, having a lot of different experiences, sort of going through and building these partnerships and relationships, there is nothing more stifling than when somebody says, "Hey, we would love to engage you in volunteers, and oh, by the way, we would like money as well." Of course, you always want to work towards the greatest amount of support that you can get, but again, over time, you don't want to, pull a rope-a-dope on somebody, and because again, it goes back to managing their expectations. You're talking about volunteers, so please keep the monetary asks aside. Now, when we're getting back to managing the expectations, this is where we want to make sure that they are fully understanding what the ask is, what the commitment is. So ensure that before you even make this ask, that you have all the knowledge that you could possibly give. The knowledge would inform a potential volunteer of any orientation or training that needs to be done before they become an active volunteer. The amount of time that training takes, if there are several different sessions, if it's in person, if it's online. You'll also want to make them aware of any commitments, if there are confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements or proprietary information, where they have to sign certain commitments that they should not breach if there are specific policies, if there are very specific tasks or skills or deliverables that they are to perform or provide. Make sure that they know all of that up front. Again, there is nothing more detrimental to a relationship than pulling the rug out from underneath somebody after they believe that they knew everything, only to be hit with a surprise. And then once they know everything, then work on gaining that commitment. Now, once you gain that commitment, assuming that they have everything that they need to make that decision and commit, make sure that you go through the process of providing some semblance of an orientation and training. The type of orientation and training will vary depending on the position that this volunteer plays. Again, there's a spectrum of volunteers that exist. There are, on one hand, traditional and episodic, more traditional type of volunteers that are one-time volunteers. There are key volunteers who sort of play a role that is more akin to being a staff member who is unpaid. Then there are skilled and pro bono volunteers, and then there's board level service and committees and advisory boards that might exist. That's a whole spectrum. So you'll want to make sure that the type of orientation and the training that is provided is appropriate based on the type of volunteer and the commitment that they are making. And then you'll also want to be available for any questions or follow-up that might be needed. Now, once you get to the event, again, the event might be an in-person event, or maybe it's a virtual form of volunteering where they're not physically creating anything tangible, but they might be volunteering virtually, and that's certainly the case right now. But you'll want to make the placement, and you'll want to have some sort of appropriate supervision or oversight in place to make sure that, beyond the training and the orientation, that the volunteers have another staff member that they can lean on so that they can get comfortable. This might also require some on-the-job training or some supervisory sort of probationary period where the volunteer is being shadowed for a portion of the time, and then making sure that they're equipped to actually carry out the function that they're being asked to perform. Assuming you get to the conclusion of the event or the conclusion of the task or the project, you'll want to provide some immediate acknowledgement of the service. There are different forms of acknowledgement. There are everything from as simple as a verbal recognition and thank you to handwritten letters and cards to more formalized rewards and awards or other forms of acknowledgement. But most immediately, you'll want to acknowledge their service and thank them. And then beyond that, you'll want to, again, this is back to, working on that retainment. They're now in your system, they've went through the event. Now it's about keeping them connected and giving them opportunities to connect and stay connected. Stay connected to the mission, stay connected to your staff, stay connected to other volunteers they may have met. This could be in person or virtual means, newsletters, social media. You'll want to create a post-event communication that allows them to stay connected, because the next step is that second call to action. Again, they're coming off of a feel good or a high. Ideally, if they have a great experience and if they believe in the mission and believe that they had an impact, then they're going to be coming off of that event with a feel good and the feeling of wanting to do more. So you'll want to provide a more immediate opportunity to support. This could be in the form of a future event. Let's say you have an event that happens from month to month. At the end of the first event, this might be the opportunity to say, hey, and oh, by the way, you had a great time at this event or doing this certain project, but we have another one that's coming up and we would love your help. Or we would also love the help of others. So if you know other people, please refer them. If you have a group who's interested, please share this information. And then after that call to action, you'll want to also connect with the volunteers to understand the experience that they had. Getting their feedback will be instrumental to understanding the goods and the bads of your volunteer program, and then also help you write up an after-action report to improve on your processes. And then secondly, you'll also want to connect with the program staff to glean any feedback that they have, but then also understand the effectiveness of the volunteers supporting those specific programs. And then lastly, once we reintroduce the volunteer back through the life cycle, this is where we start to think about retainment. In a perfect world, once we get back to this point, we should be able to more effectively and more efficiently move back through the outreach, rapport building, and recruitment. Of course, if we're talking about a first-time volunteer, getting them to come to a second event or to support another function or another project or another program is important. You can't lose sight of the rapport building, but this is another opportunity to, again, strengthen and reinforce that outreach, rapport building, and recruitment. You'll be able to go through that much quicker, but this is, again, another opportunity to go back through that process and just to reinforce the foundation that was already created from their first engagement. So what is this all about? What is the big idea here? The big idea is you want to get out of the habit of expending all your energy on recruitment. Just as you would look at a for-profit company or a nonprofit and their hiring practices or how they are able to retain their paid staff, there are studies out there that exist that report how much more costly it is to lose and have to recruit paid staff. And so the idea is about longevity and retention. The same goes for volunteers. While they're not being paid, there is a staff cost that exists for having to recruit. So what we want to do is we want to really focus on that the essential elements of that engagement lifecycle, because by doing so, we're able to reduce the preoccupation that comes with recruitment that could be detrimental to your entire operation. And what this really goes back to is that, continual recruitment, it expends too much energy. And by doing so, it actually begins to become a negative impact on your entire volunteer engagement process, because it can really distract from everything else that you're doing. And there were other studies that show that recruitment dominates 10 to 1. There are a lot of organizations that exist. Again, there are 1.5 million registered tax-exempt organizations here in the United States. It's estimated that close to 88% of them engage volunteers. And when I say that recruitment dominates 10 to 1, I would say that many of those nonprofit organizations don't have robust volunteer engagement or management practices. And so they get really lost in the recruitment aspect of that life cycle. And by doing so, they expend more energy on recruiting, which is incredibly costly. So we want to reduce the amount that we're spending on recruiting, and we want to make it efficient and focused on retainment. And then again, as you're going through that process, you just want to be aware that you're not seeking volunteers from the same spot that other organizations are seeking volunteers. This is called a common pool. And so a common pool of volunteers would essentially be a pool of volunteers where you might have several or more than several organizations seeking volunteers from the same source. And what happens when you do that is you end up, in some instances, you end up with burned out volunteers, and that becomes very detrimental to the amount of support that you're able to get from them. And then the last thing that I'll say is you really want to invest in the volunteer management process, because by more highly investment in the volunteer management process, you're able to reduce the amount of recruitment that is needed. So in summary, we talked about the different entities that really engage volunteers. Again, this includes corporations, nonprofits, government agencies, in some cases houses of worship, and education institutes. We also talked through the 9 different elements that exist within the volunteer engagement lifecycle that must be implemented in some fashion to assure a more efficient action. And then again, when we talk about the existence of those 9 elements, this is all about the bigger idea of reducing the amount of energy expended on recruitment by really focusing on retainment by having a more efficient volunteer management practice. And that really concludes that training. It was meant to be short and sweet. I don't expect everybody to come out of here being an expert in volunteer engagement, but what I can say is that those 9 elements to me are the foundation of having a good engagement life cycle. And if you have any trouble, or if you have any additional questions or need services, know that I am here to support. I would ask that you stay connected. You can find my website. It's jerometennille.com. You can also find my blog, which is called Responsible AF. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. And again, I provide services in volunteer engagement practices for both for-profit companies and nonprofits alike. And so if you're seeking services or you have any other additional questions, again, please reach out. Don't be a stranger. Look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.